Hello, nerds. Welcome to the History of Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you for being here. Today, we have Pulitzer Prize winner Debby Applegate. That's right, we snagged ourselves.
History Nerds United.
Absolutely fantastic conversation. Debby is so much fun. You're not even going to hear the whole thing. We talked forever, and I just recorded some of it. I could have talked to her for hours. It was a great time. We talked about her book, Madam, about Polly Adler, who was a notorious New York madam in the early 1900s. And then we also talked about the book that won her the Pulitzer Prize, The Most Famous Man in America, about Henry Ward Beecher. We dive into both books. We dive into how Debby does her research, what it was like to win the Pulitzer, and lots of fun stuff. On that note, I'm going to shut up and let's just get to it. Let's talk to Debby Applegate. All right, welcome, nerds. We have Pulitzer Prize winner Debby Applegate. Debby, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for asking me. I'm thrilled.
First question for you, does it ever get tiring to hear Pulitzer Prize winner Debby Applegate? Do you get used to it at some point, or do you still like it every time you hear it?
I mean, it is it is my thing. It's the thing I have my little check. Glad I got it. But when it first happened, it was such a surprise, so unexpected. It felt very strange because all of a sudden I was somebody who, sat alone in the library for 10 years, who nobody knew. And I was really a nobody. And all of a sudden people treated me like I was a somebody. So that was very surprising. It took a while to get used to. It's not the worst by any means. But as I was working on the second book, and things dragged on, and I took so long. And then it was going even longer than I thought it was going to go. Part of that was because, in fact, I had the Pulitzer Prize, people were inclined to cut me more slack than really was appropriate and was probably good for me. But the real problem was at a certain point, the Pulitzer started to feel like it was mocking me almost. Like now I felt like a has-been. How could I not have published another book after all this time? So now that the new book is out, I'm glad. It definitely props everything up. But sometimes I do feel like, maybe I have to earn it all over again, which I don't think I will.
Because the Pulitzer process, it's not like the Oscars where it's like, you've been nominated for months and you're waiting for this big day. Like, my understanding is all of a sudden you just kind of find out one day that, hey, this is a thing now.
Yeah, that is exactly what happened. I had just gotten home from the gymnasium and the phone all of a sudden just started ringing. I had a house phone and a little flip phone because it was that long ago. And all of a sudden, everyone was calling. And that's how I found out, although it was unfortunate because I am not, as I say, I am a sedentary library goer most of my life. But I happened to have my very first black eye, a small black eye, but I had been wrestling with my goddaughter and whacked my head. So when the local newspaper called, the New Haven Register called and said, "Can we send a photographer over?" I was like, really? Finally, somebody wants to take my picture, and I've got my very first black eye. So you can actually still see the picture on the web. And he has taken it sort of with me like 3/4 of the way there, like as if to hide, like shadowed the bad eye there. And I look very wry in it.
And now, before we were talking on this podcast, you actually admitted it was a bar fight. I don't want to throw you under the bus or anything. We're going to move past it. There are no charges. We're going to move past it.
I'm a pool shark in my other life.
So just real quick, your first book, The Most Famous Man in America, Henry Ward Beecher, that's the one that won you the Pulitzer. I did a little research myself because as I read it, I'm like, I wonder how many people actually knew about him before you even put out the biography. And so I asked some people who would know nothing about it and people who do read history. And even still, until your book comes out, like nobody knew about him. Everyone I had to say, you do know his sister. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, all that stuff. Was that something that drew you to writing about him, is that he's from this famous family, but he's not known to contemporary people really at all?
Well, it's funny that you ask that because I have been thinking that I clearly have a pattern. And my pattern is I why can't I just write another book about Abraham Lincoln or George Washington? Those always sell. It doesn't matter how many you write, that people still want to know, and they actually know who you're writing about. But I have a strong bias towards writing about people who are not remembered, who once were. This seems to be my new bailiwick, that people who were once very famous and very influential, but have been entirely forgotten. I think there is something about the challenge of bringing somebody back from the dead that I like. I think there is also the fact that what I really like to do, and I'm sure we will talk more about this today, is what I really like is the research. I like the detective work, the following my hunches. That's why I say sitting in the library. The writing is the payment that I have to shell out to pay for the time that I spent researching. And so when you deal with somebody who has now become obscure, but was once famous, it's kind of the sweet spot as a researcher, because there's actually a lot of stuff out there, but it has just been lying neglected, waiting for somebody to discover it.
Now, considering the gap that we'll talk about in between your two books, is it also possible that you love your research too much? I think you already kind of got to this, that perhaps somebody needs to sit there and say, Debbie, no more research now.
Well, they tried. They're my editor. I mean, here's the rub. Well, there's many rubs if we want to go down that road. A lot of rubbing altogether in this new book. By the end, my wonderful sainted editor, who had been so patiently waiting for this book and trying to nudge me along without hurting my feelings, without shutting me down, unsuccessfully, he retired a week after I turned in the manuscript. So it was quite frantic. It wasn't just frantic like it has to be done, but no, it has to be done now. So it is true. So that I guess I feel two ways. Yes, clearly I took too long. I indulged myself in ways that are silly. And in that sense, I do feel like I overinvested. No matter how great this book is, no matter how well it does, how could it repay all that effort for me personally? But then the other thing is, no, that was so much fun. I got to constantly tread through the 20th century in all kinds of byways and highways that I would never have gone. And it's hard to imagine trading that for something as silly as meeting my deadline.
Well, I would say, so your sainted editor who retired, do you think it was because he was waiting for the book to come out and then he dropped his papers? Or you stressed him out so much that he finally decided he had to get out of the game? Do you know?
It was stressful. I mean, he was definitely stressed at the end. I was just like, listen, don't stress me out even more, because God knows what will happen if you say it. But no, I think it was just good luck that after 13 years, I decided now was the time. Thank heavens.
And the result is Madam, about Polly Adler, talking about mainly early in the 1900s, kind of throughout that time. She is, as we said, Madam, and you're going back to your double entendre, lots of rubbing, like that's the whole thing.
I shouldn't have. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you should have, because we're going to get into it, all right? We got to lean into this. But what drew you to Polly? What made you say that? And I mean, once we get into it, it's going to be so obvious, but I want to ask that question. What made you say Polly Adler? Because you make it very clear at the end of your book, I never wanted to do another biography again. And here, book number 2 is a biography of Polly Adler. What about Polly made you say, this is what I'm going to spend over a decade on?
Well, you are absolutely right. I did, after that first book, think this is craziness. This is no way to make a living. Make a living. Nobody uses the word make a living, the phrase make a living, when you talk about writing biography. It is a notoriously shaggy and long, overwhelming beast to try to tame, even at its best. But winning the Pulitzer was flattering. And so, my ego felt good. And as I have said many times, I do not have children, but I do think you forget. Like when you have a child, you think, oh my God, that was so much painful labor at the end. How would I would never do that again. And you sort of forget and you think, oh, look at that nice child I've got now. And so I thought, well, maybe I will write a book. Maybe, since people are saying I should. And it was really just happenstance. I thought that the 1920s would be a fun place to go. It would probably have been smarter to stay in the 19th century with Henry Ward Beecher and the abolitionists and the Gilded Age. Again, because I liked the hunt, I wanted to do something new. And so I thought the 1920s or the 1930s, the Jazz Age, flappers and the Great Gatsby and gangsters. It'll be fun. And so I was just walking through the stacks of the Yale Library in the section that dealt with 1920s history. And there was this little red volume, scarlet red cover. I pulled it out, and it was the memoir of this woman that I had never heard of, this woman, Polly Adler. And it turned out she was a very famous madam. I knew nothing about her. I didn't really have a particular interest in the sex trade. But this memoir was fabulous. It is terrific. It's still a great read. I highly recommend it. It is shorter than my book, and it's much less true than my book. But I just fell in love with her story. Much like Henry Ward Beecher, she is a kind of a Forrest Gump figure, if you will. She seemed to know everyone, and everyone seemed to come to her place. Politicians, sporting figures, entertainment figures, businessmen of all kinds, the true upper crust aristocracy of America, if we have one, all seemed to come through her house. And of course, she'd had many adventures as well. She was deeply involved with organized crime, and that'll take you down many a path. I could see two things. One is there's enough here already. If all I have is just the newspapers and a little bit more and know more about some of the people in her life, I could put together a book from this. And then the other thing was she's the kind of person I enjoy spending time with. Like Henry Ward Beecher, who was a minister who would have loved to have been a saint. And she is clearly someone who is a perfectly happy sinner, no thought of being a saint. They have the same kind of personality. They are open-minded, open-hearted. They are very funny, very self-deprecating and funny about themselves. They are not the most educated people, but they have a lot of natural intelligence and moxie, and they really like people and they understand people. So they were great lenses to open up wider stories.
Not to compare them too much, but what I felt through reading both books is Polly's a lot easier for me to like because she is who she is throughout the entire thing. Whereas Henry Ward Beecher, without giving away too much of how that book ends and how his life ends, there was a lot under the surface there. There was a lot of things that he was always trying to sweep under the rug. Now, Polly didn't want to get arrested, but she also knew that she was playing a game the entire time, and she never pretended she was someone she was not. Is that something you felt that you were doing that, or was it just something that if you look back, you're kind of thinking that's an interesting comparison?
Well, what is interesting, first of all, is that I don't think a lot of people would say that, actually. I do not usually read reviews. I'll read professional reviews, but when people are kind enough to write, like on Amazon or on Goodreads, I am deeply grateful, but I get nervous. What real readers think, not professionals who are, that's their job. They should be nice to each other because all the writers will be nicer to you. I happened to accidentally see one of my Amazon reviews. They were very nice. They gave it 4.5 stars. But then they said, there is not one nice person in this entire book about Polly Adler. I do not like any of them. And they're terrible people. And I thought, well, that's not how I felt, but I could. Some of them are just sociopaths. But I thought, wow, of course. And in fact, they said, if you want to read a nice book, read the first book. I see what you mean. Because Henry Ward Beecher, for those who haven't read the book, imagine that, he was an extraordinarily famous minister, from a very famous family of ministers. His sister was Harriet Beecher Stowe, the great writer of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the great abolitionist novel. And that's probably how he would best be remembered, if he's remembered at all, is as her little brother. But at the time, he was as famous or more. And he had the first megachurch in American history in Brooklyn Heights, still stands there, Plymouth Church. And he was famous for his political opinions, for being part of the anti-slavery movement, and for having a major sex scandal. And the big question of that book was he really guilty? Because it was a hanged jury when he went to trial, and people were in tremendous disagreement about it. And he himself denied it, of course. So a big part of my job there was to decide how much of a hypocrite is he. I could see he was a little bit of a hypocrite, as we all are. And I could see he was not the saint that he wanted to be or that some people thought he was. But many times when I was working on Henry Ward Beecher and I thought, nah, and I loved him. I really enjoyed his company and I really liked so much. I thought he had such a great influence on American culture in so many ways. And yet every once in a while, I'd think, God, you're such a jerk. What are you doing? Don't do that. Whatever about your wife. No, and definitely don't do that with the governess. That's and your own parishioner. And what is the matter with you? And so, yes, absolutely. There were times that I just thought the hypocrisy is too much and his own efforts to salvage himself were too much. Polly, she has many more secrets, actually. And she says, I am no hypocrite. I am who I am. And I'll tell you who the hypocrites are. They're the men who come to my house and will pay through the nose for pleasures that nobody should probably have access to. And then act like I don't exist or maybe even try to arrest me, because a lot of the times the people who were in her house were cops and politicians, even sometimes moral reformers, much as she was perhaps a more honest person in some ways for someone who had to lie for a living. The book itself was harder. And more than once I felt, my gosh, I am not just writing about the underbelly of the jazz age. I'm writing about the underbelly of the underbelly. I'm writing about how even the worst gangsters and bootleggers are still lying because they have to lie to their wives and girlfriends.
Well, I mean, Polly's a dream in that throughout this thing, there are names that you don't have to be a history nerd to know. I'm not going to say the 2 or 3 that I'm thinking of because if somebody reads it, I want it to pop out and be like, what? But there's everybody in the 20s comes through New York at some point, New York or Chicago. They come through New York and inevitably they somehow are in Polly's orbit. But at the same time, she's the dream because she's going to give you so much to work with because you could just go down all these rabbit holes. However, as you've mentioned, they're not going to talk too much about their crimes and document it. And because of what Polly does, she's not going to put everything out there and make it all shiny and everything. She's going to do some obfuscation. When you, who is obviously an addict to research, run into that, how do you balance that out? How do you balance with, this is what she's telling me, but it doesn't quite line up with what I think reality is? At what point do you say, now I can say something with authority?
There's a lot of answers to that question. And some of them are like formal questions, writing questions, and some of them are research and judgment questions. Perhaps the most lucky thing that made the biggest difference on that question was she was a pack rat who wanted to be remembered. So she saved trunks of memorabilia, programs, letters, scrapbooks of herself and her friends, little trinkets, things that from her childhood. Most of that, sadly, did not survive. Her brother, Sam, the last surviving Adler, was very ashamed of her. So he threw out a lot of her stuff. But some survived. So I had a little bit of her own personal life to work from. But even bigger, perhaps, was the fact that I lucked out and found a suitcase with the writing notebooks and correspondence of Polly's ghostwriter, who had helped her write her memoir, the one that I first discovered, House is Not a Home is the title, published in 1953. And this writer, brilliant writer, a woman named Virginia Faulkner, had kept extensive notes that included not every name, but a lot of the names that had been cut out, a lot of the names that had been changed. There was one list in the back of one of the notebooks that said, cannot be mentioned. And it listed probably 20 guys, all of whom were the biggest racketeers and gangsters still living in the 1950s, who were all being interrogated by the Kefauver hearings, actually, right at that moment. So that helped orient me. So even if it wasn't everything, I knew much more and I felt more confident. But then there is always going to be a point, even with the best documented, most upstanding person, where you have to use your best judgment so that it becomes less about having an absolute answer and it has question of likelihood. The more you know, the more you're able to judge probabilities. So that I would often suggest I did not know for sure, but it was quite likely. And then the other thing is a kind of writing technique that I feel is important, even in our own lives. We can all experience the exact same phenomenon and have very different descriptions of it and very different truths about it. It is the unfortunate part of any family argument or anytime you're asking a witness to testify that the mind, and everyone interprets their experience differently. So what I like to do is put the various voices in dialogue together, in argument together, so that if somebody says it was like with Henry Ward Beecher, I didn't have to always adjudicate whether or not something was true. I could say, well, his father thought this, and his mother thought that, and I can tell you his friends at college thought something entirely different. And if you're telling the story, you're telling the story of that conversation. If you're doing it right, you're giving the reader the feeling of being in the room with the people arguing, making their own best case for their position, and they get to decide. I think that's often the most honest way of doing it, and it's also a little more pleasurable for the reader.
See, that's why you won the freaking Pulitzer, I'll tell you what. Well, when I'm reading your books, right, because they're dense, they're longer, right? Like you're not doing a 200-pager, right?
Next time.
Yeah, you say that, but all evidence to the contrary, Debbie.
We don't know each other well, but I see we know each other well enough, Brendan.
But what I find is your books still go by pretty fast, and it seems like you have so much research that you're really just paring down. I felt like in both books, I knew these people by the end of it, that when they did something in their next step, it made sense to me that all of these things that led up to that point, they would do that because you feel like you know them, you feel like you understand them. Even with Henry Ward Beecher kind of taking a hard left turn, you left a lot of breadcrumbs from the beginning that, hey, maybe it's not all good, right? Whereas Polly, like we said, she was doing what she had to do to survive. And she's an immigrant from Russia. She's trying to get away from all of that. And she, from the very early age, was a survivor, period, done. Like she was just a survivor. Now, is this a situation where, because I know a lot of authors do this, was the first draft of this book like 800 pages? And then the editor comes along and says, we're going to condense it down? Or do you try and keep it tight even with all your research?
Boy, you keep asking questions with too many answers that I could offer. I try to keep it tight in general because every writer hates to cut. Well, you've got your babies in there. You spent all that. But biographers, they have it worse because they're like, I found it out. Nobody will ever know if I don't tell you everything about this subject because who the hell is going to do all this work again? It's even worse, I think, the temptation with us. So I like to write basically the length. Unfortunately, I actually don't like writing these sternum crackers. That's not the kind of book I like to read. But in particular with Polly, part of the problem was you are right that one of the charms of the book and her life is you've got all these characters coming through. You've got Duke Ellington, you've got Milton Berle, you've got Huey Long, you've got, Lucky Luciano, people popping in all the time. But to make it sense of it, I have to tell you why I'll tell you what, sadly, a lot of people have no idea who Milton Berle is anymore. There are probably people who don't know who Joe DiMaggio is and Lucky Luciano. So I had to stop and contextualize them all the time. So her world had to expand. The book had to expand so that you could see her in her wider world. Otherwise, frankly, the business of running a brothel is, it's very mechanical. You're on the phone all the time. It's the same thing. Everyone's just coming through doing the same thing every night. And so there's a lot of repetition, as I suppose most jobs have. It would not have been very interesting. So the book ended up being much more of a history of the period. I mean, that's what I like about biography. I like it when you can use the main character as a lens to tell a big epic story. But this one, more even than the Beecher book, had to keep expanding out. And that was why it took so long to research also, because I was like, well, she's deep in the world of jazz. I've got to explain why jazz matters. Why is it called the Jazz Age? Or gambling. I don't approve of gambling, but I actually now know and enjoy a great deal of gambling culture. And every point I'm like, oh, one more moment. I've got to take a little detour in both my thinking and my research and what I have to give to you, the reader. And that's a big part of why it turned out so long.
Speaking of things that you didn't know about that you had to get into, how much did you learn about syphilis?
Oh my God! Because in fact, it is super common. I can't remember what the actual statistic is about what is the estimate of how many people suffered from syphilis and gonorrhea in the 20th century before we had penicillin. But it is a huge, much larger percentage than people realize. And in fact, many more people actually died based on long-standing tertiary syphilis that had been in their system from probably when they were a young fella, and went on to have a perfectly respectable life. It kind of goes into the body and comes out at the end. But of course, that is not something that most people have on their death certificates because it's such a shameful thing. And here's the problem. I don't mean to be flippant about this, but there were so many ways of treating syphilis before penicillin, most of them horrific, arsenic and mercury and various kinds of poisons that it put into the body in ways that some of them just absolutely don't even want to describe them.
And if you do, I'm just going to beep it.
Never. So, but in one sense, I still like, what would I do if it were 1920 and I had to go figure that out? Things like that. Good Lord, even just birth control. I thought I had a pretty good handle. It's not rocket science, but even that, things like that, how would you get it? It was illegal. It was illegal to tell people about it you couldn't send anything through the mail. Trying to figure out little details that give texture to this life that is both very similar to ours and very different. That's where you can really get lost.
Well, here's a fact for you, because I read a book right after yours. 17% of the male population of New York City had syphilis in the mid-1800s. So that's even before this.
Wow. And it's funny because my sainted editor, Jerry Howard, great classic editor who's a very important literary talent spotter, I should say. And we talked about language at the end because there is a lot of rough language in the book. I use a lot of the language of her time and place, which is very different than the language of 100 years later, where we're much more sensitive on all kinds of scores. But the one thing we are not more sensitive about is talking about sex. I feel like I'm not squeamish, but I am nothing compared to like 20 somethings who will talk about anything, anytime. And so he kept saying, I don't know, do you really need to describe how you get an illegal abortion? Or do you really need to say, that's going to be, and I would say, no, that I can say. That I don't have to worry so much about. The other more sensitive things, racial identity, ethnic identity, sexist language. The sexist language is very heavy, so please be prepared. That's where I felt we had to tread a little more carefully.
And you do have that note at the beginning of the book where you just kind of explain that, because it's not even like you had to quote somebody or something like that. These people's names, that what they called them, were using this, and then even saying things that I'm just not going to go into.
Right.
It's part of their names, right? So you can't even refer to this person and be honest about it as a historian unless you actually write those words into it. But at the same time, do you still kind of feel squeamish like nowadays? Do you have to put it in there and you just say you have to be honest about it? Or is there situations where you'll think, if I don't have to use it, I'll just push it to the side and get by it?
Well, certainly epithets like, say, the N-word. That's certainly, it is once or twice used because, as you say, it's a nickname. That's the only way there is to identify this character. But I would not use that word in any other setting if it weren't necessary, because my belief is certain words that we're especially sensitive to in this moment. I'm not going to take responsibility for future generations. You'll just have to live with this. It's like shrapnel. If you have to use an epithet to convey something that you know is going to hurt somebody's feelings, okay, if you have to, then it's a bullet. You have to shoot that bullet. But if you don't have to, then it's just like the shrapnel heading out into the air and hitting people for no good reason. In fact, that note, that warning at the front, that was sort of our compromise. Okay, well, we're going to use some of this language, but we're going to let you know. So at least you can close the book now. But I also feel like it's important to use that language. I often think of myself as not just a cultural historian, not just an intellectual historian, but a historian of rationalizations. How is it that people tell themselves that what they're doing is okay and is the right thing to do? And if you don't use the language that they themselves would use, you are really missing a tremendous amount of the atmosphere. As much as if you aren't describing what they're wearing or you're not describing where they live, you are missing a big part of the furniture of the period, and especially the 1920s and 30s. If there is a moment of it, it really is truly, America is really truly a melting pot. It is in New York City between World War I and World War II. And the language reflects that melting pot.
And especially around the 20s, it was just so interesting the way they looked at things, because they're using these horrible words and they don't quite know that it is yet.
Sometimes they know.
Yeah, sometimes they know.
They know.
At least they better know now. Don't do it. Anyway, but Polly gets beat up a lot by her friends, right? Like somebody is looking out for her, and she mouths off to them. They'd give her a good whack, and then by the next day they'd probably come back and, apologizing, and then saving her life the next week. And there's that whiplash, right, of this is what was okay then, right? It shouldn't have been, but they looked at it as okay back then.
Well, I mean, you really are talking about two sets of people. You're talking about cops and you're talking about gangsters when you're talking about her taking it on the chin, literally. And which is, it should be said that's ironic, but it's not ironic. The vice squads and the criminals were deeply intertwined. For good reason and for bad reason. It's funny, a lot of people have mentioned the number of beatings she takes, which at least is 3 or 4. And I'd forgotten just how many, because, she lives in this very rough milieu. She is the queen of the underworld. She's the female Al Capone, as they say. Well, she herself was considered very upright in a world of villains. She was considered a villain you could trust. She was considered honest, not a thief, not a blackmailer. And yet she herself, she took a lot of beatings, but on the other hand, she did not give beatings. She thought of herself as a fair boss, but, she was responsible for making sure a lot of women made their living through peddling their bodies. And that has a lot of bad consequences for a lot of the women who worked for her. She never forced them into sex. And she sometimes would try to get people out of the sex trades. Nonetheless, she herself was no angel. There is no doubt about it. So you have to suspend. I mean, maybe this is the real answer to the question is, if you are a historian in general, you have to suspend judgment. As they say, the past is a foreign country. You cannot entirely judge other people by your own standards. I am a big believer that you, of course, want to hold everyone to decency, but that is unrealistic to expect that everyone will be decent.
And you talking about Polly, it feels very much like in a bad world, she was as good as she could possibly be, right? Because when we think about pimps, we think about madams, we think about really sometimes very horrible people doing horrible things to other people. And like, as you mentioned, she did say, like, she never talked anyone into the game or something like that. Is that what you found in the research, that a lot of that pulled out? Or do you think that she may not have been nearly as good as she wanted to come off as?
Yes, I think, we could probably say that about everyone. Nobody is ever as good as we want to portray ourselves. But B, I would say she in particular, I think like a lot of madams, like a lot of people in the underworld and in the sex trades. So let me start by saying this. The problem with dealing with prostitution, but legally, culturally, is that it's going to exist forever. It always has existed. It is impossible to stamp out. And B, that it does encompass both people who choose to be in this business, who have decided rationally and logically, looking at their own best interest, that this is the way that they can best make a living, they can best support their family, plan for the future, whatever it is they need. But there are also just tremendous number of people who are genuinely forced into the sex trades, who are sex trafficked, who the old phrase was sex slaves. And Polly would make the distinction that as a madam, she was one of the former, that she chose this, even if it was not a choice that she wanted to make, she chose the trade, and that she wanted only to work with other women who had chosen this trade freely. And then she makes quite a distinction between the pimp, who she feels tends to force women either into the trade or to stay in the trade, who takes all their money, who will beat them up if they don't earn enough money, who are true exploiters. And I actually do think that distinction is a fair distinction. And she had a great reputation in the business. At some point, I was looking at her FBI files, and J. Edgar Hoover at some point decides he wants to really get something on Polly. It'll be a real feather in his cap. And the agents are interviewing all kinds of pimps and prostitutes who come through their net and asking if they can get something on Polly. And to a person, all of the people they interview, the pimps and prostitutes, say, oh, no, she doesn't have to get women from across state lines, which is how they would be able to arrest her, make it a federal crime. She doesn't even have to recruit, because she has such a good reputation that people come from across the country to work for her. And Polly herself said, I turn down 30 people for every one I take. Last answer to your question is, no, I do not believe that she never initiated anyone into the life, as she likes to say. There are many stories from other people who knew her quite well saying, she would proposition any woman who was good looking and looked like they might be willing to do it in the ladies' room, in the ladies' lounge, the manicurist shop, the beautician. Actresses, she specialized in particular in showgirls, were waiting for their big break. And she said to him, look, I can help you when you don't know how you're going to pay your rent, or when your next meal is going to come from until you get your big break. And, that is not a very pretty picture.
I want to switch to just a little bit lighter part of the book. And I actually want to talk about two side characters, okay? Now, I want to thank you, first of all, for giving me an answer of, if I'm in the 1920s and I want to start up a bromance, my number one pick is Robert Benchley.
Oh.
I didn't know anything about him. And whoever that reviewer was that said everybody was mean and terrible in this book completely goes over Robert Benchley. I had never heard of him before. Could you just give a little background on him? This is like one of the most stand-up hilarious guys I've ever heard of, even, if you wanted to hang out a brothel.
You have picked right away my favorite character of the whole book, including more favorite than Polly. Robert Benchley was a humorist. He wrote humorous essays. He was a kind of flippant theater reviewer. And he later went to Hollywood when Hollywood moves into the talkies. The minute Hollywood needs actual dialogue writing, all of a sudden they're very interested in getting writers and performers from New York who know how to talk and know how to write. Because before it was just moving pictures. You can still see him on YouTube and in old movies. He had a series of short films, how to sleep, how to buy groceries, how to shave, that were little humorous short pieces that would run before the feature films. And he was probably now remembered, if he's remembered at all, as part of the Algonquin Roundtable, which was the New York version of the lost generation of the writers of the 20s and also the 30s, who gathered at the Algonquin Hotel, humorists, playwrights, critics, some actors who were famous for being famous. They were what we would call cultural influencers now. Probably the one who is best remembered of that whole group was Benchley's close friend and Polly's close friend, Dorothy Parker. She was a poet whose humorous, bitter little humorous, acidic poems are still cited and all the time by cynical young women everywhere. And the problem is it's not easy to be funny for a later generation. So it's not easy to look back and read some of these essays and think, okay, that's good, but it's not laugh out loud funny to people nowadays. Benchley was both Polly's close friend, but he was also one of her most enthusiastic and longest-lived clients. And so writing about him was both a joy and a sadness, because he was considered perhaps the most lovable man on the planet by everyone who knew him. Everyone wanted to be his friend because he was so decent. But of course, he had this whole secret life. He was married, he had children, never divorced his wife. As he said, when asked by his friend James Thurber, what are you fooling around with? What about your wife? And he says, listen, a man has his wife and that's his business. And that's all there is to say about it. And he becomes a terrible alcoholic. It was both a joy to have him in the book, but also very sad to sort of trace his arc, his flowering and his decline. And eventually, he is one of those people who dies of cirrhosis of the liver and probably complicated by syphilis.
But before all the terrible stuff happened, he was, first of all, I looked up some of his work just because I wanted to see, as you said, it's hard to be funny much later on. So first of all, some of his stuff still holds up. I giggled quite a bit reading a few things. But what I loved about this book and what makes him such a lovable character is he never leaves Polly's side. I mean, there are literally situations where people say to him, you need to get out of here. You have a name and your name is going to be ruined if you're around Polly Adler. And he always refused. He was always there for her no matter what was going on because he did put her first in a lot of situations.
Yeah, and that's why people loved him, because he was that kind of guy. And he also did another thing that was a great help to Polly, that he was such a cultural influencer himself. Polly could like to call her brothels speakeasies with a harem handy nearby, so that he was among the first to say, look, let's just treat this like a speakeasy. We'll all go, women and men alike. We'll all hang out there, have a nightcap. And yeah, you can go off into the bedrooms if you want, but we're going to treat it like our clubhouse. So he brought tons of people. He and the bootleggers are the ones who really made her house chic, that kind of underworld chic that was so glamorous during Prohibition. And he brought another someone who became a very good friend of Polly's and a very important customer, the industrialist, the heir to two of the great fortunes from the 19th century, a guy named Jock Whitney of the Whitney Museum, you might remember now, and many, many other things. And he was at the time one of the richest men in the world, and he becomes a very close friend of Benchley's. And so that he was a very close friend and regular customer of Polly's. And together, they had exactly that kind of attitude I was talking about at the beginning. They were not snobs in the least. They were as happy to hang out with Dutch Schultz or a comedian from, the Lower East Side, as long as they were decent people, as they were to hang out with the Vanderbilts or the Astors. They were the kind of people precisely who were not hypocrites, except, of course, everyone was a hypocrite. Prostitution's illegal.
I want to bring up another side character that I really enjoyed, but I know this is also a sore spot for you. I want to talk about Showboat.
Ah, yes.
Because she's so important, but she's also too much of a mystery for you. I know that much. Can you tell me who was Showboat and how about trying to look into her life?
That's very nice of you to ask about that. I'm sure there's more that I could have learned if I'd spent another 13 years, but this one I really never felt like I could learn more about Showboat. So one of the things that's very important to running a brothel in this period is you have to have help. You need to have maids, you need to have cooks, she needed to have a second in command. And it's really when she hires this woman who I really actually was never even able to fully get her real name. I think it might have been Marie Gould. I'm not positive. She is African-American woman with a very commanding, charismatic personality, great sense of humor, very smart, very tough-minded, and becomes basically Polly's second in command and maybe even co-manager in some cases. And Polly would never have been able to be as successful as she was without having Showboat by her side and there to help build this little empire of hers. Again, I spent tons of time trying to figure out where did she get her nickname. And one of the members of the Algonquin Round Table was a woman, a novelist named Edna Ferber, who was very successful and who wrote a big novel called Showboat that became the musical. I'm pretty sure that's where it came from. She pizzazzy. She sort of had a certain kind of showbiz charisma. When Polly is writing her memoir, she is going to write Showboat's a major character, not just Showboat, but also many African Americans. She doesn't really cater to them too much as customers, and she has very few women who actually work for her who turn tricks for her are Black. Although I do think she had some, because she was someone who would provide services no matter what you wanted, she would find it for you. And she was deeply involved, as I say, with jazz, which was very dominated by Black musicians, and with Harlem, which was the hotspot for, anything goes up in Harlem. And so she was often the guide that would take white people up to Harlem and make connections for them so they could go to the nightclubs and the rent parties. In the end, when she's finishing her memoir, she needs to get permission slips from everyone who she mentions. And most people, surprise, surprise, at least she was surprised, I was not, did not want their names mentioned in her memoir. And we're not happy. Now, some were, and God bless them. I find the people in show business were a lot more willing to let their reputation hang out. And of course, the criminals. But anyone who was respectable, mostly did not want their name in it. But Showboat was one of them. She says, listen, if you're going to use my story, my likeness and my name in here, you're going to have to pay me. And she's the only one who says that. And Polly, who was always tight with the dime, even in the best of circumstances, she'll be damned if she's going to pay Showboat a dime. And so she refuses to pay her. And at the last minute has to completely write her out and make up, somebody to replace her story. And it still to this day really bothers me because not just as she's a major character and I would have loved to know more about her, but also because she would have opened up this whole secret world of Black employees, Black women in particular, who made the underworld run. I think we would have learned a lot as history lovers.
And now anyone who follows you on Instagram, which should be everyone, hint, hint.
And I should post more.
You post way more than most authors, but we're not even going to get into that. But one of the things that has really come up for you is it's definitely this book has made you think a lot more about the sex industry. Just because it talks about that. And as you kind of mentioned before, this is something that has been around time immemorial. What are your thoughts now after spending so much time with Polly, looking into the sex industry? How has it made you look at it differently or even really look at it when you hadn't looked at it before?
So one thing is I did for sure think not just about the sex trades in general, talking about that idea that you have to get into people's heads. It was very important for me to try to convey Polly's decision-making because we treat the sex trades like it's just a cesspool somehow that we could not possibly understand how anyone could possibly do it. And so one thing was to try to get into her head and the heads of the women around her how do you decide that this is something that you can do and that you will do? So I did a lot of mental sympathizing, empathizing, trying to figure out how you get there. Well, and once you start thinking of it as real people, not like a problem to be solved in the state legislature, it doesn't become clearer what to do. The problem is, as I say, if you want to treat it like legitimate work, which in many ways I do think it is legitimate work, it's hard work. It's like being a ditch digger, a psychologist, and an actress all rolled up together. But it's also dangerous. You are, and it's not just dangerous, you are intersecting, even if we're completely legal and completely safe, you are still, as a prostitute, intersecting with people's darkest, deepest desires. There's a reason why Eros is one of our primary drives and also the basis of everything Freud discovered, which is it is deep inside us, it is mysterious, and it is not always pretty. It's always going to be a difficult job, even if it were completely legal and safe. But as I say, there's also always going to be people for whom this is not a choice, for whom it is not safe, and will never be safe. And it is not legitimate work. It is a form of slavery in some ways. I've thought if somebody asked me what laws would I pass, I am not sure that there is ever going to be a set of laws that will truly allow it to be legitimate, safe work and also stamp out the sex trafficking. Look at prohibition. We stigmatized alcohol in prohibition. It not only did it not stamp out drinking, it made drinking glamorous in a way that it never had before. And I think the same thing, we can stigmatize sex work all we want. It does nothing to stamp out sex work.
If you could only choose one, who would you rather hang out with, Beecher or Polly?
Wow, nobody's ever asked me that. First of all, I think they would like each other.
I think they would, yeah.
I think it would be very fun. They were both very funny people, and a great. They were both, as Polly likes to say, I can't help it. I'm just the kind of person who gets a kick out of life, even if it's a kick in the teeth. And Beecher was always saying things like that. I guess Henry, then I'm going to hurt either one of their feelings. I guess Henry's a little tiny bit more educated, so perhaps the topics would be wider. On the other hand, Polly actually knew more real writers, so her store of stories would probably be great. All I can say is, wow, that would be a hell of a dinner party, and for sure. I do like to take a drink, and Henry did try to be a teetotaler, so perhaps I would enjoy at least taking a cocktail with Polly a little bit more.
To me, it's Polly, hands down. Between her own stories, the stories of people around her, however, she was notoriously tight-lipped at the same time. It kept her alive. So when do we find out that Madame won the Pulitzer? And related question, can I come to the after party?
Oh, you are a doll. Although I hate to disappoint you, because one of the things I decided when writing this book was, much as I would love to win a full slate of prizes again, that I was choosing a topic when I chose Polly that was, less likely to appeal to. I was once a judge on the Pulitzer Prizes, and I think that they certainly would be open to it. But, there is a little bit of a tendency to want to give it to a character who has a little more, a little more cultural respectability. If it had come out, maybe when the Jeffrey Epstein thing, the Harvey Weinstein would need to, if I had just been a little speedier, it's possible that it would have hit the zeitgeist a little differently and maybe felt more like something people wanted to recognize that way. But you know what? It won't matter if it doesn't win a prize. If somebody makes it into a movie, that's all I want. And I don't even care who plays Polly. That game, I've played that game many times with Henry Ward Beecher. People say, if you could make it a movie, who would you want? And I had settled my heart on Philip Seymour Hoffman, who looked like Henry Ward Beecher, who lived in Brooklyn Heights, who had all of that kind of charisma of the man who, as Mark Twain once said about Henry Ward Beecher, when he's all in the full tide of sermonizing, he is really handsome, but when he's not doing anything, he is ugly as a singed cat. But then Philip Seymour Hoffman died, and I was like, well, I'm not playing this game again.
Oh, yeah, you would tell Hollywood, no, I'm sorry, Hollywood, I'm not going to sell this to you.
What I would tell Hollywood is, you do whatever you want. I don't care. You change it. I'm not going to be a fuss budget about it.
Every single person that comes on this podcast, I ask the same final question. You're a Yaley, very intelligent, but what trashy TV are you watching? Everyone wants to know. I need you to admit, and don't get this, I'm always in the Yale library, I don't have time to watch TV.
I'm not going to pretend. I like popular culture. That's why the characters I write about are popular culture, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I got to say, I have watched all the trashy TV of our COVID years, starting with Tiger King, Bridgerton, for gosh sakes. That one, I was like, I cannot believe I'm really watching this all the way through, but I did, and I will probably pick it up again. Although the thing that has been bringing me most joy, though, is those little PBS, American masterpiece kind of things. And I loved the All Creatures Great and Small. Give me a nice British accent and some farm animals that are low stakes. Is the foal going to come out all right or not? That's at this stage, I don't want any more excitement. I just want a stiff drink and a nice, gentle English show that makes me feel good about myself.
Well, Debbie, I could go another hour, so you're just going to have to come back and we'll do part 2 on literally absolutely nothing. Just like you said, we'll do it on absolutely nothing. But thank you so much. This was amazing.
Thank you. It was a joy.
And that's it for this episode. Debbie, thank you so much. That was a lot of fun. Everybody, please go on out there, follow us on everything. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, follow, rate the podcast wherever you can, wherever you listen to it. We really appreciate you listening, following, and doing all of those things. Couldn't do it without you. Listen, nerds, let's talk soon. Bye.